Hi everyone, I'm Steve Smedley, Acuity Associate, and welcome to our second webinar in our spring series that aims to pick up white paper themes. In this case, the prospect of consumer regulation backed by publicly available consumer metrics. I'd also like to introduce Kirsty Wells from Housemarque. She's the head of Devolved Nations and has the best job title since Boudica, Queen of the Celts. Kirsty will be reflecting on the Scottish experience of consumer regulation and metrics and what the English can learn from it to aid your preparations for the inevitable. Before I hand over to Kirsty, just a few housekeeping issues. The webinar is scheduled to last for an hour. If you've got a tech issue during the session, use the chat function on your toolbar at the bottom to contact James. James, if you could give everyone a wave. James will sort out everything for you if you've got problems with your sound, etc. Kirsty's going to take some questions at logical pauses as well as at the end. So if you've got any questions for Kirsty, and don't use the chat function because that's just for James sorting out your tech issues. Use a little Q&A function on your toolbar at the bottom. And try and post a really succinct, to the point, coherent question. I'll be sifting through those questions and I'll be putting them verbally to Kirsty so we don't get into some kind of mad multitasking. Kirsty's very kindly said that we can record this, so it will be available on the website shortly for posterity in case you need to go back to any bits and bobs, but similarly direct any of your colleagues who couldn't make it today to our website and they'll be able to catch up. I think that's it in terms of the boring stuff. So without further ado, it's over to you, Kirsty.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, can you all see that okay? Yeah. Okay, good morning everybody. I'm really delighted to be here speaking to Acuity members about Scotland and regulation in Scotland. As Steve said, I'm head of Housemarque Scotland and Devolved Nations. I can't lose a Housemarque Scotland when I'm working in Scotland, but I do work over in Northern Ireland and Wales as well. So I'm being asked to talk, as Steve said, about consumer regulation in Scotland. We don't really use the word consumer in Scotland, I have to say. We talk more about tenants and tenant regulation. Ironically, as Steve said, you know, what can the English learn? When I joined Housemarque in 2012, I'd been working for the Tenants Information Service in Scotland for 13 years. And what was coming in Scotland was actually coming from England in terms of the TSA and the work that they'd been doing around tenant empowerment and tenant scrutiny, but obviously with the change in government in England, that changed things for you in terms of regulatory frameworks. So it is really interesting to be here talking to you about Scotland, where, as somebody who's worked in the sector for 25 years this year, I feel like a lot of this did actually come originally from England, but we'll leave the politics out of it for the rest of the session. So the Scottish context is that a Housing Scotland Act was passed in 2010 and introduced Scottish Social Housing Charter and also set up our regulator, Scottish Housing Regulator, as an independent regulator for the first time. The background to the Scottish Housing Regulator is that it had been part of Community Scotland, which was acquired all of the Community Scotland staff into the civil service, the mainstream civil service, and set up the independent regulator under the Housing Scotland Act 2010. So the way to think about it is that the charter belongs to the government. So we have the civil service team and ministers, and the two documents here are actually the second iterations of these. So the first charter ran from April 2012 to March 2017, and during 2016 was reviewed, and this blue document, the first one was green, and I only mention that because the civil service were very proud of their blue. So that was launched in April 2017, and similarly with the regulatory framework, that was launched in 2012 as well, and then reviewed and updated, but it was updated after the charter so that the regulator could take account of any changes in the charter. So sometimes I think what happens in sector in Scotland is people actually forget that the charter exists and that that is a government document, because within the sector people are really focused on the regulator and reporting to the regulator on an annual basis, and some of that is what I'm going to cover this morning. But the charter very much is there, and is probably the key relationship now between government and tenants. We do have a network of registered tenants organisations in Scotland who meet with a team within Scottish Government, and that work is guided by the charter. The regulator also set up a national tenants panel, and tenants do communicate directly with the regulator as well through that national tenants panel. But even before the pandemic, that was much more of an online panel, a sort of survey, completing surveys and questionnaires rather than a face-to-face survey. So from both government and regulator, there is heavy connections to the tenants movement within Scotland. So what is set out in the charter, and I know that within the white paper in England there has been references to some kind of charter. It's 16 outcomes and standards, and they cover 7 key areas, and I've listed those 7 key areas for you rather than go through the 16 outcomes and standards. They are seen as the kind of outcomes that the government would like to see landlords deliver for tenants, but without being prescriptive, because the prescription comes from the regulator in the KPIs that it collects on an annual basis. So just to give you an idea of the getting value for money outcome, what the charter document says is that social landlords manage all aspects of their businesses so that tenants, owners and other customers receive services that provide continually improving value for the rent and other charges they pay. It also then says that this standard covers the efficient and effective management of services. It includes minimising the time houses are empty, managing arrears and all resources effectively, controlling costs, getting value out of contracts, giving better value for money by increasing the quality of services with minimum extra cost to tenants, owners and other customers, and involving tenants and other customers in monitoring and reviewing how landlords give value for money. So you can see that that's quite a broad general statement, and it's about housing management and effective control of costs. What it doesn't say in the charter document is how landlords are supposed to do that in terms of the measurement of that, and that's what's left to the regulator. So in terms of the regulator, when the Housing Scotland Act 2010 was introduced, as I say, it made the regulator completely independent of government with its own board, but it must report to ministers annually. So both the chair and the chief executive can be called to Scottish parliamentary committees to give evidence at any point on the work of the regulator. So the guy in the top photo there, George Walker, he's the second chair of the regulator, and Michael Cameron at the bottom, he's the chief exec, and he's the only chief exec so far of the regulator. The other board members are selected, and the Scottish Government controls or leads, I guess, on that selection process. So they're about to advertise for 2 new board members. There are also tenants that sit on the regulator's board. So there's a mix of people with real kind of professional backgrounds. George came from the financial services. But there are also tenants, so that the regulator at a governing level is very much hearing the views of tenants right at the heart of decision making. Just to give you some insight, the statutory objective when the regulator was set up was to safeguard and promote the interests of current and future tenants, people who are homeless, factory owners and gypsy travellers. And for a while, whenever you went to a meeting with the regulator, it didn't really matter who was there to represent them. They liked to kind of remind you of this objective because, you know, they saw it very much as their right to promote and safeguard the interests of tenants. And I'm not going to cover it today, but we do have regulatory interventions in Scotland. There's been about 12, I think now, mainly actually interestingly for acuity members in the smaller organisations, although there has been a couple over 1,000 units. But in those cases, the regulator can appoint managers, special managers and board members to an organisation that it sees as failing. And in one case just recently, they did actually direct the transfer of that organisation. So a small association in Glasgow has become part of Sanctuary Scotland, which is part of the wider Sanctuary group. So they will act if they think that tenants' interests are not being safeguarded, and that has primarily been around financial and governance issues when they've done that. So in terms of their functions, obviously they carry out their functions very much regulating the performance of social landlords. And that in Scotland applies to all local authorities and all housing associations of any size. We don't have ALMOs in Scotland, so it does apply to all social landlords. Gypsy travellers is only for local authorities, so the housing associations are not expected to report performance around gypsy travellers. So that's kind of a little bit of background to the regulator here, and I do know that, like Michael as chief exec, works very closely with Fiona McGregor and the other regulators in Wales and Northern Ireland as well. So there is a UK link up in terms of housing regulation, and I know that both Wales and Northern Ireland have also been speaking to Scottish Housing Regulator, not just about our regulatory framework, but also about the IT and business intelligence systems that they use. So in terms of what happens from a landlord point of view, there's an annual process. So currently everybody's working towards the 31st of May. That is the same date every year, and they have to submit to the regulators through their portal what's called the ARC, the Annual Return on the Charter, and that's where the KPIs are collected for performance and satisfaction. And it's worth mentioning with satisfaction that satisfaction became statutory. It became obligatory to report your satisfaction as part of the new regulatory framework, and that was actually based on Housemarque's STAR framework. At the time, Ipsos Murray did research and recommended that the regulator adopted the STAR framework, and that is what happened. And so that came from Housemarque into Scotland via the regulator. So everybody works really hard in terms of getting their annual return in. That is required to be consulted with by tenants before it's submitted to regulator. Landlords will do that differently in terms of tenant scrutiny groups and how much detail they actually give around either the KPIs or this sort of full report that goes into the regulator. It also should be signed off by board members before staff submit it to the portal. It's ultimately the governing body is responsible for ensuring performance is met in relation to the charter, but there are obviously varying standards across the sector, and obviously in local authorities that involves councillors as well. The next stage then is the 31st of August, so from 1st of June through to the end of August, and it was delayed last year, but they have said this year they will go back to 31st of August. SHR makes all landlord data available in files openly available on their website that can be downloaded, and for us in Housemarque it means that we can use that data ourselves. So that's all publicly available in CSV files. it obviously anybody within any of the organisations that's interested, and including things like, you know, the Royal Bank, other lenders and things can all access that data for the sector. So that happens at 31st of August, and then by the 31st of October, each landlord is required to report to tenants on their performance, and I've got some examples to show you of that. Again, there's varying standards across the sector. I would say there's been general improvements over the years, but as you'll see, there is still different approaches to how that happens. So that's the 3 key dates that everybody has to work to on an annual basis. When the regulatory framework was reviewed, there was a requirement to or the regulator asked for annual assurance statements. Lenders had been pushing the regulator to have some kind of rating like you have in England, but we've shied away from that in Scotland. What we have is now that you're compliant or not compliant or working towards compliance if there's a couple of failures, but there is work ongoing, and that's just come in April this year. So for the first time, if you go to regulator's website, you can see what regulatory judgment they've been given, and generally I think pretty much everybody has been given either compliant or working towards compliant. Don't think anybody has been given not compliant. So this was new as of 2019 and had to be submitted for the first time at the end of last year. So obviously just as the pandemic was hitting really. There's the deadline for these is similar, that is the 31st of October, but the requirement is that it can go in any time between April and October. So the idea from the regulator was that they wanted a gradual stream of them coming in between April and October. They didn't want everybody submitting on the 31st of October. The regulator does produce an engagement plan every year for every landlord. Sometimes there'll be more engagement than others, depending on the issues that they find within landlords. Obviously, there's a team of regulation staff working closely with all landlords. So every landlord does have an engagement plan, and as I said, as of this year, also has a regulatory judgment. Again, tenants should be consulted about what information is going into the annual assurance statement, and the statement is supposed to be signed off by the chair of the governing board or the chair of the relevant committee within local authorities. What's been quite disappointing is that the regulator thought it would help everybody out and suggest a sort of 2-paragraph template to say that you meet the requirements of the regulatory framework, and therefore you're giving assurance to the regulator that you're compliant. And disappointingly, a lot of organisations have just used that standard template and said they're compliant. They haven't shown a lot of initiative around creating an original document. But there has been a few, and if anybody's interested, Grampian Housing Association in particular is a really good example where they went into quite a lot of detail about where they saw room for improvement. But like for me, I've worked all my life in the sector. I felt it was a missed opportunity for landlords to show a bit of originality and openness and transparency as well around their assurance statements. And so for me personally, I guess, not Housemarque's view, but my personal opinion, it's been a bit disappointing. So tenants should be consulted before the assurance statement's put in, and then they should also be informed of the regulatory judgment through, and the requirement for that is basically that should be on the landlord's website. There's no more duty than that in that field. So in terms of some of what I was asked to cover today, in terms of making data accessible to tenants, what you can see there is the Scottish Housing Regulator's portal, and I've put the link at the bottom of the slide. I can send this slides on to Steve so that they can be circulated along with the recording. So you can see there that I've obviously gone into the the tab on landlord performance, and there's a range of information there that's available for people. They did take part in an innovation project a few years ago to try and develop a chatbot that would be able to answer questions that tenants asked it about landlords' performance, but that chatbot has never appeared. It was part of a Scottish Government programme called CivTech, where public sector bodies have an issue or a problem, and entrepreneurs and innovators can provide solutions. And they did work with an entrepreneur, but it doesn't seem to have been successful so far. So the range of information that's available there, you can see the landlord directory is all of the information on every landlord, but then there is also national reports, and they will do thematic reports. So they will look, for example, at gypsy travellers, or they've looked at homelessness in Scotland. They've also done a report on rent affordability. So those thematic reports are done periodically when the regulator feels it wants to do a deep dive into a specific issue. In terms of the statistical information, I'm going to show you some of that, but not all of it. There is what we call in Scotland AFSs, so the annual financial statements. So they are all uploaded to the portal as well, and the regulator makes that data available in spreadsheets too. So what that means from a Housemarque point of view is that we are able to compare global accounts data at an English and a Scottish level and pull that into our own global accounts tool. But I'm not going to go into detail of the financial data today. So in terms of making data accessible to tenants, there's this comparison tool, and this is what the other regulators in Wales and Northern Ireland have looked at, but so far as I'm aware, neither of them have been able to afford to kind of develop this. And the regulator has won awards since for this business intelligence tool, although it does slightly have its limitations. So what you can see there is that I chose to benchmark Hillcrest homes, but within the tool you're only able to compare up to 4 other landlords, which doesn't really create a robust peer group in terms of the data that anybody would want to look at. And obviously this is publicly available, so Joe Blogs can look at it, anybody who's interested in it. So you can see there that it compares the 4 landlords, and the first data that it brings up is the Hillcrest, who I chose first, the average stock numbers across each of those other landlords then, and the difference for Hillcrest from the average as a total of the landlords.
Kirsty, just briefly, is it possible to just knock out your next slide view there, just to make the existing slide just a bit bigger at all?
Oh, are you not seeing my full slide?
No, not seeing. We're just seeing a view with the next slide as well. That's the one.
Oh, you should have told me at the start, Steve.
It wasn't an issue before, but I think it's just on this one. I'll shut up now. All
right, sorry, you should have told me that. Sorry about that. Okay, apologies everybody. We saw what's coming next. So this is the portal, the landlord portal for people to do that interactive benchmarking. I don't know if my mouse is moving on the screen, but you can see here there's an option to look at previous years, so that does give you previous years data, but it just gives you them in sort of little tables there, and then you can open them up further to do that. And if you want to compare with other landlords, you obviously can just hit the reset comparison button. So it's a good tool, and the regulator is very proud of it. But from a data point of view, you can see that you can only compare 5 organisations at a time. So what we did in Housemarque is we built a tool that is publicly available as well. You don't have to be a Housemarque member to see this. It's on our public facing website. We built a tool using Tableau. it's all the SHR data. So as I said earlier, we're just able to download it and manipulate it. And we feel, and we've had feedback both from TPAS Scotland and Tenants Information Service, who I used to work for, that this is easier and gives more comparators for tenants. So what I just did to set this slide up was I selected City of Edinburgh. So you can see, instead of being limited to 5 organisations, it brings up all of the landlords here whose main area of operation is City of Edinburgh Council. You can see here that it's just got two indicators: satisfaction with value for money and average weekly rent, and that's obviously across the 2 axis, and it gives you the results in here. So this is interactive on our website, so that you can see, if you hover over any of the dots, it'll bring up who it is. But what we also excuse me, built in as filters was stock size and average weekly rent, so that if you wanted to look across Scotland at landlords with similar rents or similar stock size, you can filter on there. You can also filter on the years of return, the landlord name, so you can build a small or big a peer group as you like, and you can also choose only housing associations or local authorities. So we've had great feedback about this tool. We do need to do some work to update it, because unfortunately the regulator, when it put all of the 1920 data on its website, changed all of the reporting and the spreadsheets, and so they're in a different format, so we can't just upload it the way that we had done previously. So the team are working on that, but it just gives you a feel for you know, there is more that can be done with regulator data, and that, you know, might be the case in England as well. So I really wanted to focus a little bit on satisfaction and some of what the regulator does. So the regulator, as I said earlier, puts out an annual report on the sector's performance, and always talks about tenant satisfaction initially. And that is linked to the statutory duty around protecting tenants' interests. The regulator decided, you know, when it was set up and with the charter, that its focus would be driven by satisfaction of tenants, not by any of the other standards and outcomes around value for money or estate management or communication. It would be driven by overall satisfaction. And I think, you know, you'll see it towards the end of the presentation that potentially has caused issues. Housemarque as a UK organisation, when we do UK analysis, satisfaction in Scotland is always higher than any other country, and I think that is by the, you know, driven by the regulator. And what this chart shows you here is that in the first year of the charter, when data was reported, there was overall satisfaction was 88% in the sector, and it reached 91% in 17-18, and it's hovering around 90%. The 1920 report isn't out yet. The data's out, but they haven't put out the report yet. And you can see that they do also report satisfaction differently for local authorities and housing associations. And in the early days, that also caused a bit of controversy, because the local authorities felt that, you know, they couldn't do a full census of their tenants the way smaller housing associations could, and that, you know, even with the kind of methodology and the weighting and everything, they felt that they would always look worse off than housing associations in relation to satisfaction. There was also quite a lot of discontent in the early days from local authorities about the move to the 5-point scale away from a 4-point scale, and a lot of local authorities didn't like that there was a lot of tenants who chose to the neither option, but that's kind of died down, and it's not been changed. If it was going to be changed, it would have been changed at the review of the charter in 2016, and they kept the 5-scale option. So, you know, I think that kind of the objections have kind of died down a bit. But what I feel, and I say, you know, I worked for TIS for 13 years as well, so I've kind of been in the tenants movement for a long time, is this emphasis on the regulator around satisfaction has not by any means all quarters of the sector, but in some areas it has driven perverse behaviours, because what landlords did was they wanted to get better satisfaction results, so they changed the methodology of how they were asking the questions, and we'll talk about that in a wee while. They maybe changed when they were asking the questions as well. So this is your big, in Scotland it's required every 3 years, it's your big perception survey. None of the transactional data that's collected feeds into this. This is all perceptional data. So it was almost like they were changing the way they asked the questions in order to get better results, when actually the whole point of the charter, when the government developed the charter, was about delivering better outcomes and services to tenants. And I've had arguments with chief execs where, I have said to them, it feels to me like you've forgotten that you're supposed to be improving outcomes and services, and you're actually just focusing on how you're going to increase your satisfaction figures. Again, just a very personal opinion, but I do think that has happened in some areas in the sector. Just it's probably worth giving a little bit of context to the Scottish sector as well. We have 32 local authorities in Scotland, and 26 of them are stockholding, 6 transferred their stock to LSVTs, and we also have around 160 housing associations, but of that 160, 80 have less than 1,000 units and 40 have less than 500 units. And while in the last couple of years there has been the odd merger, there has not been a move yet to amalgamate at any great scale any of those smaller organisations. And at the other end of the scale, we have Wheatley Group, which is now around 90,000 units, and it is completely unique in Scotland. The second, so Glasgow Housing Association, which is the main subsidiary of Wheatley, has just under 50,000 units, and the biggest housing association next to that was Dumfries and Galloway Housing Partnership at 10,000, but that has now become part of Wheatley Group. That's now called Wheatley South. So there's actually Wheatley Group, and then there's no other association now in Scotland with more than 10,000 units. So it is quite a different sector to England in terms of its scale. So just to kind of show you some reporting to tenants. So East Lothian Housing Association is kind of held up as the digital first association in Scotland. They produce figures about the number of transactions with tenants online in terms of self-serve and things now, and they've done some quite wacky annual reporting to tenants. I think actually there was a Star Wars theme at some point, and a lot of interactivity within the website. But in terms of the reporting, and obviously you can all look at this in terms of going to their websites. What this does is only reports LHA's performance annually to tenants. So this is what they have to produce by October every year. You can see this as their 2020 performance, but actually if you take that outcome for quality of housing, it doesn't give tenants trend data, and it doesn't give them comparative data. So while it might look good on the website, actually for those tenants that want to be informed and perhaps are involved in scrutiny, there's additional work to do in having to go either back through previous years or to find comparators. So it looks great, but there's not a huge amount of substance there. Cairn, which is a larger national organisation, it's not particularly clear on the slide, unfortunately, but you hopefully can see there that they are comparing themselves with the Scottish average. The green coloured line is the Scottish average and the brown line is Cairn. And then on the right hand side, where it says average time taken to complete non-emergency repairs, they are given 3 years data as well. So this is one of the better examples of an online tool that gives that trend data as well as the comparative data. And then Glasgow West Housing Association, which is a small housing association in Glasgow, they are still quite traditional. I was going to say old-fashioned, but I'll say traditional. And this, while it's on their website, is also still kind of produced as hard copy for tenants. And although it looks a little bit more old-fashioned, actually what you can see is it's really clear for tenants to see Glasgow West's own performance in terms of 2 years of data, but also they've chosen specific peer groups to benchmark themselves again. And obviously the red, amber, green is really clear for tenants to see in terms of that RAG rating. And then also they've got this bit, you know, which is obviously quite common practice. You said we did in terms of what people have complained about or commented on, and what they've done about that. So maybe looks a little bit more old-fashioned, but probably gives tenants ease of access to the data in terms of what tenants might be looking for. So I'm just going to move on to sort of finish the presentation, the last few slides, in terms of measuring satisfaction, because I do think there are lessons that can be learned, and you know, as senior staff, it can give you something to think about in terms of what's coming in England. So obviously there was status in England. I think that was just kind of dying a death when I joined Housemarque, which was obviously again abolished by the government. There was no requirement for kind of standard collection of data around satisfaction, and so a lot of organisations started to use Housemarque STAR methodology, which we've always made available to sector. You don't have to be a Housemarque member to follow the STAR methodology, and that STAR methodology underwent a significant review last year and involved landlords in Wales and Northern Ireland as well. Because the regulatory framework had just been reviewed in Scotland, we decided not to include Scottish landlords within the review. It felt it wasn't quite politically correct to do that. So we have a new Housemarque STAR framework with updated questions, updated methodology. So you've got the option to ask questions online and by text and things now. And a lot of that work fed into the work that was going on in the Consumer Standards Working Group, which obviously has informed the publication of the white paper. And there is now talk in England, as you'll be aware, of the Charter for Social Housing Residents. And I guess the case for regulation comes, as we know, out of Grenfell and the fact that tenants there and residents felt that they weren't listened to, and that despite expressing dissatisfaction, you know, no action was taken. Tenant roundtables kind of backed up from other social tenants that, you know, landlords weren't listening, and that there was a feeling of landlords not being trusted. And I guess there's also, you know, scepticism potentially within the ministry and the regulator about the figures that some landlords are producing. And there was also a sense that although some landlords, you know, a lot of landlords have continued to use STAR, other landlords have moved away and used different methodologies. So I actually was speaking to Rant and Rave last week, who collect real-time data for landlords, and some of the bigger landlords had only started to kind of collect that real-time data and weren't continuing to do the larger perception surveys. So there was a need to kind of bring all of that back in to some kind of systematic process. So some of you, I'm sure, will be aware of Jonathan Cox, my colleague, who's our kind of satisfaction guru. He led on the STAR review. So Jonathan pulled some figures together in terms of the case for regulation, and using STAR methodology in other sectors. You can see whether it's the hairdresser, the bank, or the NHS, the levels of satisfaction that are collected from consumers within those sectors. When similar work was done in England with landlords, when landlords or providers were asked to self-report their satisfaction rates, overall satisfaction of consumers, they reported 86.7%. But when it was collected by MHCLG, it came in at 70.8%. And our survey, which was as part of a STAR review when we collected data from 13,000 residents, was at 70.1%. So you can see there that the data supports the argument that the scepticism within the regulator and the ministry that landlords are potentially over-reporting the satisfaction of their tenants and other customers. Some of the other variables, and again, if you're familiar with collecting satisfaction data, these won't be new to you, but I think it's just worth highlighting, that other variables can impact on satisfaction. And at the end of the day, one of the challenges I've always made in Scotland to the regulator is collecting satisfaction and basing your kind of overall judgment on the sector is it's such a like personal opinion. It's, you can have a good day and you might rate somebody a 2, a bad day and you might rate somebody a 2. You could have a great day and you could rate them a 10. And that's one of the issues, I think, where, yes, there's a whole lot of other data backs up what the regulator does, but the kind of overall satisfaction measure being reported as that lead measure in Scotland, as I said earlier, I do think has created some issues. So you can see there, there's some context about your location. People in urban areas tend to be less satisfied than people in rural areas. Resident profile in terms of age, traditionally older people will be more satisfied than younger tenants, and also tenure type. And this is really interesting because you talk about leaseholders in England and Scotland, we call them factored owners, and landlords do have to collect satisfaction data on factored owners as well and the services that they receive, and that traditionally is very low. Factored owners are not particularly satisfied with the services that they receive. So tenure type, in Scotland we only have social housing. We don't have any of the other tenure types that you have in England in terms of affordable housing as well. But all of that can play into how satisfied people are. And then the collection method and the response scale, if people haven't been using the 5-point scale or a 10-point scale, which is comparative, can obviously skew results. Whether it's done in-house and people know the people who are asking the questions, that can obviously result in more positive scores compared to it being outsourced and done independently. And then in terms of the timing around the transactional perceptional surveys, the season can play a big part in that, and what we will see, I think, is the pandemic will play a part in that as well, in terms of people's mood and how landlords have reacted within the pandemic. But people generally are happier in the spring and summer, so quite often if you carry out your perception surveys then, you will get better results than if you carry them out in the winter or the autumn. So all of those will have an impact on your overall performance, and those are things to bear in mind, and all of that is contained within the new STAR guidance for things for you to think about. So I just wanted to finish just sort of with the message, don't be an ostrich, I guess, and don't kind of obsess with those results, the percentage, and how you might game your results to raise your results by 1 or 2%. Don't become obsessed with that and lose sight of the fact that all of this is about services to social tenants, people who really, really need those services, and that the standards and outcomes that you're delivering as social landlords is what we're about. That's what we are as social purpose businesses, and that's what you should be focusing on. And just to take that a little bit further, if you are getting great satisfaction notes, in terms of CSAT scores, that's fantastic. but really understand how it was achieved. Is it because you're delivering fantastic results, or is it because you've meddled a little bit with how you've asked the questions? If you're going to set ambitious targets for improving your CSAT scores, don't do it without a clear plan on how that will happen, because obviously with the bigger perception surveys, you're going to only ask them every couple of years. And that should involve tenants as well, in terms of the tenant scrutiny role that scrutiny groups have. And don't stick your head in the sand. Don't ignore the feedback where actually, it gives you something to act on in terms of service improvements, just because it doesn't fit with your kind of business narrative. And also, pretend that you're not aware of methodological tricks, because we all kind of know that's out there and can be having an impact on overall scores. And I guess next steps for you, Jonathan heard just from the regulator at the end of last week that the consultation on the satisfaction measures and the white paper generally is going to be out in December this year. I think it had been anticipated that it would be earlier, but that's just hot off the press, that they're now talking around December. Understand what your satisfaction data is telling you now about what is your baseline on your current satisfaction levels. Obviously, the size of the QT members, you should be taking a census of your tenants and residents, but obviously for larger organisations, they will take a sample, and that approach should be consistent, every couple of years, so that you've got that benchmark and the baseline to start with. Think about making your interactions as easy as possible, and that's not just about collecting the satisfaction data, that's about day-to-day business with your customers. We used to think in Housemark that ease of access to repairs was what drove satisfaction, and that if you could sort out your repair service, that would really drive improvements in your satisfaction levels. But actually what the STAR review showed is it's ease of doing business with the landlord that is driving satisfaction. And that may well correlate to what happened after Grenfell. But if you have made it straightforward for your tenants and customers to be able to contact you, however that might be, in person, by phone or online, that is definitely now having a key connection to overall satisfaction. Take your complaints seriously, and obviously there's new requirements in England around the ombudsman and complaints handling, but I'm not close to the English Ombudsman, but in Scotland we have the SPSO, the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman, and across all of the public sectors that they're involved in, they have a huge emphasis on learning from complaints, and they actually run complaints handling networks so that people can learn and share with each other what improvements they've made on the back of complaints. So learning from complaints is a huge opportunity to hear the voice of dissatisfied tenants and try to make improvements on that. And then overall, ensure that you've got a strong performance reporting framework. In good Housemark terminology, you can't really understand, what's driving your satisfaction without understanding the costs of service delivery and also the performance of services within your business. So make sure that all of that is tying up together, so that you have a clear insight into your business performance. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kirsty. I think it was really useful. I mean, the fact that Scotland's got a charter and the phrasing or the terminology used as far as our white paper is concerned talks about a charter, I think it's highly likely we'll end up with something. And so the components that you went through from start to finish in terms of the regulatory framework built around what we call down here consumers, I think we're going to get some kind of version like that. So what you set out for us is a little bit of a glimpse into the future, but at the same time, like you say, because it was sort of leveraged off what we were doing in England 10 years ago, it kind of seems a bit familiar in a kind of TSA style as well. So I'd encourage people to put their questions to Kirsty using the Q&A function at the bottom. We've got none at the moment, but that's not a problem because I've got some.
All right.
Picking up your points about satisfaction and how important it is, and of course, certainly the English regulators talking very much, and the white paper talks about satisfaction metrics in a kind of a broad sense. And you actually made the point that it's mandatory. It was part of the charter that Scottish landlords have to do that. And yet they've still been able to game the system by changing the phraseology of it. So has there been any talk amongst the Scottish regulator about enforcing some kind of standard approach where you can't flex the terminology? Everybody uses a standard terminology, and you could take it further to avoid gaming and some of the inherent drivers that you showed that influence by, for instance, taking it in the same format or taking it at the same time. Some of this splurges into wider issues of data quality that has always plagued benchmarking. So I guess my point is, has there been any talk about how you stop that gaming and how you just standardize it, the way in which you go about those surveys?
Yeah, okay, so the phrasing of the questions has to be standard, and the overall satisfaction question has to be asked first, and then the other questions come off the back of that, and they obviously have to use the 5-point scale. But that's it in terms of standards. There's no other requirements around when the survey is asked. There is obviously guidance, and that's what Ipsos Murray did at the time in terms of sample size, based on the size of the landlord, or for smaller organisations doing a full census. But in terms of how the questions are asked by post or in person, or when they're asked, there's no standardisation around that, and there's certainly not, that I'm aware of, any talk of doing that. I mean, to me, I think we just say I think the regulator is proud of the fact that satisfaction in amongst tenants is high, and certainly among social landlords, obviously there's pride in that tenants are satisfied at high levels. But I've never heard the regulator kind of challenge the sector to say, is this an accurate picture of tenants' satisfaction? So we've had a situation in Edinburgh, for example, where if you looked at the council, and it's the council, City of Edinburgh Council, if you looked at their ARC return and looked at the comparative data available to them, they would claim to be one of the best performing local authorities in Scotland, and not just on satisfaction measures, on all measures, performance generally. But Edinburgh Tenants Federation discovered that tenants in Leith, and you'll be familiar with the flats if you've watched Trainspotting, they're called the banana flats, were living about 3 or 4 years ago in horrendous conditions. They had rats coming up through their toilets, through their kitchen sinks. It was just horrendous, to the point where tenants were still living in the properties when the council sent workmen to condemn them in kind of hazmat suits. So, they're not safe for council workers to go into without a hazmat suit, but it's fine that tenants are still living in them. And the council actually also denied initially that they were council properties. So it was a really, really difficult situation. And the Federation worked with the tenants, taking a human rights approach to participation to really influence improvements and outcomes for those tenants, and they have done that. But there is still a question for the regulator about, if you looked at Edinburgh's data in isolation, you'd think Edinburgh was a great performing council, and there was no evidence that that was happening in Leith, or there's now another part of Edinburgh where there's something similar going on. So I think that, you're right, Steve, around data quality and seeing the data as the can opener for the story, but what is the bigger context? And I'm not sure that the regulator is always keyed into that bigger context. You know, the regulation team are very keyed in on individual landlord performance by looking at landlord returns, and they will speak to senior staff, but they wouldn't necessarily validate that data with, for example, tenants in Edinburgh. They use the National Tenants Panel as a way of gathering tenant sentiment across the sector, but that doesn't necessarily kind of give you a deep dive into what's going on in individual landlords. So that, you know, there are gaps there in terms of what the regulator does with the data and tells the narrative around the sector's performance.
Okay. And just a general question about the what we call consumer metrics. I mean, have they made a difference to tenants? And I guess what I'm thinking about is, has it made a difference in terms of the leverage that tenants have on their landlord to make them smarten up their act? You know, has it made a difference in terms of them perhaps using the metrics as leverage with the regulator to kind of invoke an inspection?
It's not made a difference with the regulator. The tenants can raise concerns with the regulator, but that has to be evidence of systemic failure. So that's quite difficult for tenants to prove themselves. You know, it would obviously have to be a group of tenants that were doing that, and you know, potentially with support from an organisation like TPAS. So that has been more difficult. The first part of your question, I think, depends on the individual landlords, to be honest, and this, because along with the charter, scrutiny came into Scotland for the first time. So along with CIH Scotland, Housemark delivered Stepping Up Scrutiny, which was a Scottish Government funded programme for 4 years in the end, to embed scrutiny in organisations. And you do have, like I can think of Link Group, which is quite a large organisation, Riverclyde Homes, where tenants are really involved at quite a high level in scrutiny, and also have really good connections to governing boards, so that tenants can kind of express opinions at that level. But again, that's not widespread across the sector. You know, what I see in, you know, almost 9 years away from TIS is that there are still tenants involved in the tenants movement who don't think their landlord is meeting, you know, the terms of the requirements around participation. And remember, well, not remember, but because you don't work in Scotland, but prior to the charter in 2010, we also had the Housing Scotland Act 2001, which introduced the right to participation in Scotland. So it gave tenants a statutory duty to participate, or statutory right to participate, and gave landlords a statutory duty to involve tenants, and that legislation is to involve tenants at decision-making level as well. But again, you know, even though we're kind of 20 years down the line, the performance of some landlords is still patchy. And of course, some landlords would say, well, we try, but we can't get tenants to engage with us. So, you know, as long as we're trying, that's all that matters. And so, you know, we are seeing a bit of a modernisation and move to more digital participation, obviously because of the pandemic. But again, I've heard landlords say that they've had a Zoom call and they've had 2 tenants on it, and then somebody else has done their AGM by Zoom and you know, had the biggest historic turnout because everybody can dial in. So it's really patchy. I don't think there is a common kind of, you know, there's not a standard performance across the sector.
Yeah, because obviously it was one of the reasons for why we were having in England metrics out in the public domain pre 2012. It all hinged on that kind of everyone, whether you're English or Scottish, were going for improved tenant scrutiny, tenant scrutiny with teeth, meaningful tenant scrutiny, and it was seen that such metrics would be a way for tenants to coalesce around a body of evidence to hold their landlords to account. So yeah, it seems a bit of a shame that it hasn't had more traction. But we've got a question come in. So Ian Gilders is asking, aside from customer satisfaction, are there any other metrics required in Scotland which are a little different from what we've been used to?
No, not really. There are cost. There's performance measures which are standard performance measures. You know, housing management and asset management metrics. The cost measures are not as detailed as they are in England. You know, we don't have value for money metrics in Scotland the way that you've had in England. So no, I don't think so. Though, I mean, the only other thing that we have in Scotland, but again, it's not necessarily linked to the 2010 Act, it's more around the 2001 Act, is the requirement to have a tenant participation strategy and also to keep a register of registered tenants organisations, and landlords are obviously required to report on that. But that was prior to the 2010 Act. But those, I guess, those levels of participation in terms of being statutory are a higher level than in England.
Right, thanks for that, Kirsty. Nitin? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Yeah, it's kind of me and technology, man. Okay. Because I don't know how far people remember, you know, the audit commission, and, you know, it's almost like this whole idea of regulation comes kind of top down. Say inspection used to be bottom up. And I'm just wondering, you know, what is the kind of bottom up in terms of accountability to inform the regulator? And what's the inspection regime that goes with regulation in Scotland?
So in terms of inspection regime, they don't carry out kind of inspections the way that you're talking about in relation to the audit commission. They used to carry out those kind of inspections in terms of regulation managers. The regulation, every social landlord has a regulation manager appointed to them, but it's a lot more now, it's desktop exercises, you know, in terms of the data and the returns that are submitted to the regulator. And that's been one of the issues in terms of regulatory intervention in the sector, that a lot of that has relied on whistleblowing. It's not relied on regulations staff being in and witnessing things, it's relied on whistleblowing. So every social landlord is engaged through a regulation manager. So for example, like Lower Burn Housing Association, they've decided not to go back to their offices. They're going to work remotely for the foreseeable future, kind of like a sort of hub. They operate over a large geographical area, and they're going to have a kind of hub and home, roam and hub model. And the regulator has been involved in that, and tenants have been consulted and things. And the regulator, as far as I'm aware, was quite helpful in pointing things out that Lower Burn might want to consider around that. But the bottom line is we don't have a series of inspections. In terms of accountability from the bottom up, so tenants, as I said, have a statutory right to participate. That is through tenants organisations. There's also the legislation to involve tenants in a scrutiny role, you know, to be able to involve tenants in decision making. There's a huge number of housing associations in Scotland that, you know, arose out of the community-based movement, and so they either have boards that are still 100% tenants, if it's a co-op, for example, or they still have tenants on boards. There has been some challenges to sector around that, in that tenants maybe haven't been given the training and the personal development that they've needed to understand their full role as a governing board member. And you know, in the better performing organisations are now addressing that and making sure things like, you know, tenants get finance training to understand, you know, what it means to be accountable for finances within an organisation. There is some challenges around that as well in terms of good governance, in that for the community-based housing associations, if their pool of board members comes from within the local community, how you kind of build capacity within that community, because as I said, you know, some of them are tiny organisations, so that has been quite challenging, and some of them are starting now to review their terms of governance and look more broadly at who they can get onto boards, either as full members or co-opted members, so that they can broaden the skills. As I said earlier, most of the regulatory interventions have been in smaller organisations where there's been either financial or governance irregularities. So, and then to take it a step further in terms of bottom up, as I said, the regulator has its national tenants panel, where it will hear a collective view from tenants across Scotland, and that is supported by an independent facilitator who will, you know, collect and analyse that data before it feeds it into the regulator.
Right, thanks, Kirsty. And of course, it will be interesting to see what happens in terms of an independent tenant panel in this country, in England, because it certainly wasn't mentioned in the white paper. Right.
Sorry, Steve, just really quickly on that point. Just in March, the Scottish Government launched Housing 2040, which is its strategy for housing for 20 years. It's the first time there's been a strategy that's not just been for a parliamentary term, it's been for 20 years. And interestingly, within that, they're now talking about a strategy for the rented sector. And when they talk about the rented sector, they're talking about all, you know, rented sectors, social and private rented. And they are now also talking about private rented tenant involvement. So that's just new as of March this year.
Wow. Okay, that'll be interesting, especially as it's over a 20-year time frame. It sounds like the kind of consensus type politics that you need for something like social housing, which unfortunately seems to be a bit of a political football from government term to term. So having a 20-year view is probably where social housing needs to go. Any road up, I think we're up in terms of time. We're all going to turn into pumpkins any second now. So Kirsty, thanks so much for putting the time and effort into giving us a bit of
You're welcome.
A glimpse of going back to the future, as it were, I think.
Yeah,
that kind of term. So yeah, thanks again for
all
of that. Thanks everybody for attending. We do have quite a few webinars to go. They're all on the website covering white paper themes. If you haven't already signed up, I'd encourage you to do so. So yes, thanks everyone for turning up, and hope to see you at one of these shortly. Okay, bye-bye everyone.
Thanks, Steve. Bye. Bye.
Bye.